The late afternoon sun dipped low across the wide-open prairie, spilling a bruised gold over the land as if the daylight itself were tired. Cole Brennan reined in his horse on the north ridge, letting the animal shift beneath him while he stared toward the horizon. Out here, the world stretched so far and so empty that it sometimes felt like a place meant for ghosts more than the living. And on most days, Cole felt more like the former. 3 years had passed since Emma died, yet time hadn't softened the ache, only hollowed him out until he moved through his own life like a man carved from weathered wood. The ranch still ran, the cattle still grazed, and the seasons still turned, but none of it took root inside him anymore. He drifted through each day with the steady, numb resilience of someone who had forgotten the sound of his own laughter. He often rode to this ridge at sundown, drawn to the quiet the way a wounded animal seeks a hidden place. The wind combed over the grass, whispering along the slope, and the stillness wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. Yet today, something broke that familiar calm. Movement flickered near the creek bend below. Cole narrowed his eyes, lifting a hand to shield them from the sun's glare. At first, he thought it might be a stray horse or a traveler passing through. But no, this shape moved with deliberate insistence, bending, lifting, bracing. A person, and not just passing by. Someone trying to build something. He nudged his horse a few steps forward, just enough to get a better look. Down in the shallow white stone basin beside the water stood a young woman, slender, sun-worn, her dark hair braided tight down her back. An Apache woman, if he judged right, though he didn't dwell on that fact any more than he would the color of a sunrise. People were people on the frontier, each carrying enough hardship of their own without a man needing to sort them into categories. What caught his attention wasn't her face or her dress, but the way she worked. She held a warped plank steady with one hand and swung a hammer with the other, the motion stiff and weary. Her palms were wrapped in strips of cloth, stained through with red. Every strike looked like it cost her more than she could spare, yet she kept going, measured, determined, refusing to yield even as the wood split against her will. Cole exhaled slowly, something tightening in his chest. Most settlers gave up when the land pushed back this hard, but this woman bent over broken boards with the steadfastness of someone who had run out of things to lose. He watched her drag another piece of lumber, if one could call it that, from a pile of river-washed scraps along the creek. She tried fitting it into the crooked skeleton of a shelter she'd patched together. The boards leaned like drunks in a saloon corner, gaps wide enough for winter wind to whistle straight through. Yet even from this distance, he saw no hesitation in her movements. Only exhaustion, only grit. She paused, straightening slowly, her shoulders rolling back as though she was counting her own breath. The prairie wind tugged at her hair, but she ignored it and bent to her work again. The hammer rose, fell, rose, fell. And then, almost too subtle to notice, the rhythm faltered. A tremor of fatigue, a step back, a hand pressed briefly to her ribs. Cole's jaw tightened. There was a storm building somewhere beyond the horizon. He could feel it, an old rancher's instinct prickling beneath his coat. 2 days, maybe less, before the cold sank its teeth into the land. A shelter like hers wouldn't last through the first sharp wind. He stayed on the ridge, but his breath grew colder in his chest. The woman steadied a corner post, trying to align it with a bent beam. It shook under its own weight. She braced it with her shoulder, lifted the hammer again, and swung. The wood split clean in two. She stumbled back, landing hard in the dirt. For a long moment, she didn't move. She sat there with her hands limp between her knees, staring at the pieces of broken lumber as though they were the remains of a promise she'd once believed in. There were no tears, no outburst of frustration, just a quiet, stunned stillness, as if her strength had finally hit its limit. Cole felt something shift inside him. A small sound, barely a breath. Damn. He knew then, with a certainty as steady as the ridge beneath him, that the woman wouldn't make it through the coming storm. Not with that shelter, not with those hands, not alone. A thought settled over him, heavy as winter itself. She won't last until the weather turns. And for the first time in 3 long, empty years, Cole Brennan felt the cold edge of responsibility slice through the numbness, sharp enough to make him sit a little straighter in the saddle. The prairie held its breath for a heartbeat, Then the wind rose like a warning straight from the mouth of winter. It rolled across the grass in a long, low howl, bending dry stalks and rattling loose stones on the ridge. Cole Brennan felt the gust hit his coat and pushed his hat down tighter. Cold like that wasn't ordinary. It carried weight, the kind that made old ranchers look at the sky and murmur prayers under their breath. Down by the creek, the gust reached Nita. The crude shelter she'd been shaping from riverwood shuddered like a frightened colt. The weakest wall, one she'd fought with for nearly an hour, quivered, bowed, then folded in on itself with a hollow crack. Boards snapped, nails tore loose, splinters flew through the air like sharp little birds. The whole side caved as if an invisible boot had kicked it from the inside. The sound echoed up the slope, sharp and final. Cole felt the thud of it deep in his ribs. Pieces of lumber spun in the wind before dropping onto the dirt with a dull thump, each landing like the exhausted sigh of fate itself. The kind of sound that told a man everything he needed to know about how much time was left. Nita stumbled back from the collapse. For a moment, she didn't seem to breathe. She just stared at the wreckage, at the boards she'd lifted, hammered, forced into place with a mixture of grit and desperation, now lying in broken angles across the ground. Then her knees gave way, not in a dramatic fall, but in a slow, heavy surrender, as if her body had simply run out of places to hold the weight she'd been carrying. She sat in the dirt with her legs folded beneath her palms resting limply on her knees. The wind tugged strands of dark hair from her braid. Dust swirled around her boots, rising and falling like smoke. Her hands, wrapped in makeshift cloth bandages, were torn red where the hammer had bitten her skin earlier. Blood had seeped through in small, stubborn patches that the chill wind refused to dry. But she didn't flinch, didn't wipe her face, didn't curse the sky or the storm gathering beyond the far hills. She just breathed, slow, shallow, tired breaths, like someone who had been asking life for one small mercy and found even that denied. Something in that quiet broke open inside Cole. It wasn't pity. Pity was cheap on the frontier and never saved a soul. No, it was something deeper, sharper, rising up like a voice he hadn't heard in years. A voice that reminded him of campfire nights with Emma, of how she'd look at a lost calf or a stranded traveler and say, "If you can help, Cole, then help." He hadn't felt that tug in a long time, but he felt it now. Because the woman below wasn't reckless. She wasn't weak. She wasn't foolish. She was just out of options, trying, with whatever scraps she had, to keep herself alive in a land that didn't bargain with the unprepared. Cole watched as Nita raised one bandaged hand and brushed a piece of broken wood aside. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion so deep it settled into the bones. She exhaled, a faint, ragged sound carried away by the wind. No tears, no collapse of spirit, just a quiet acceptance far more painful than any scream. Cole swallowed hard. The cold in the air seemed to sharpen around him. He'd seen cattle starve, calves freeze, storms rip through fences like they were sewing thread, but he'd never seen courage run this thin and still hold its shape. He looked toward the horizon. Storm clouds were stacking up in thick gray layers, heavy enough to blot out the sun. Their edges rolled like the backs of dark, restless horses. By tomorrow night, the whole prairie would be swallowed in white. He knew what that meant. This woman, this solitary, stubborn fighter, wouldn't last through the storm in a shelter that couldn't even stand through a strong breeze. Cole turned his horse around slowly, gripping the reins with new resolve. The gelding pawed at the ground as if sensing the shift in his rider. He cast one last glance toward the creek. Nita was still sitting there, motionless, surrounded by the scattered pieces of her collapsed wall. In that still frame of distance and dust, Cole felt something final settle into place. A reckoning, a decision born not from logic or obligation, but from a part of himself he thought had withered after Emma died. Either he helped her, or the storm would finish what the wind had started. The choice wasn't complicated. He nudged his horse into a steady trot, heading back toward the ranch as twilight seeped into the sky. The cold deepened at his back. The storm waited. And with every hoofbeat, the truth echoed louder inside him. If he turned away now, he wouldn't be able to live with himself. Night settled early on the Brennan Ranch, the kind of cold, weighty dark that wrapped around the barn like a second skin. Cole pushed open the wide doors, the hinges groaning a familiar greeting as the smell of pine, dust, and old leather drifted out to meet him. The lantern he carried cast a soft amber glow across the space, stretching shadows up the rafters like ghostly fingers reaching for the light. He paused just a few steps inside. Against the far wall, neatly stacked and forgotten, lay the lumber, long, straight boards of clean-cut pine. Good lumber. Lumber he'd chosen years ago with a vision in his mind, widening the front porch, giving Emma a place to sit and watch sunsets with her legs tucked under a blanket, smiling at the world like she always did. He remembered the way she teased him for fussing over details. "Cole Brennan, you measure boards the way most men measure their words." He swallowed. The memory pressed against his ribs, warm and painful at the same time. He walked toward the stack, boots echoing on the barn floor. When he reached the boards, he rested one hand on the top plank. The wood felt smooth, cool, solid beneath his palm. Nothing like the brittle scraps Nita had been fighting with down by the creek. For 3 years, he hadn't touched these boards. Couldn't bring himself to. They'd become something sacred, an altar to a life frozen in place, a promise he never got to finish. But now, standing here in the quiet barn, he understood something he hadn't been ready to admit before. Beautiful things left untouched long enough turn into burdens. He dragged his thumb along the grain, tracing the pale lines as though they might speak to him. Emma's memory drifted through him gently, not like the sharp grief of the early days, but like the soft brush of a hand telling him it was all right to move again, to choose to help someone who needed it. The barn door rattled slightly, letting in a draft of winter air and the faint scent of smoke from the distant bunkhouse. Footsteps followed, slow, steady, and too familiar to mistake. Dutch, the old cowboy, stepped inside, coat slung over one shoulder, hat low enough that the lantern light only caught the curve of his grin. He didn't walk straight to Cole. Dutch never interrupted a man wrestling with his thoughts. He simply took his time crossing the floor, leaning against a post like it was something he'd been doing all his life. His gaze drifted to the lumber stack, then to Cole's hand resting on it. One corner of his mouth twitched upward into a knowing, weathered smile. He didn't ask a thing, didn't pry, didn't breathe Emma's name into the air between them, though Cole knew he could see the story written plain as day. Instead, Dutch scratched his jaw and said, voice low and rough like wagon wheels on gravel, "Go taught jalau kung hoa vo ik." He tapped the nearest plank with a gloved knuckle. "Jem shung toi noi kanjenji." Simple words, no pressure, no judgment, but they struck like a hammer on cold iron, clean, clarifying, awakening something steady in Cole's chest. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. For the first time since Emma passed, he lifted one of those boards, feeling its weight not as a burden, but as a purpose. Dutch helped him gather more. No more conversation, no need for it. Some things among men didn't require speech. Sometimes silence was the most respectful answer. Before long, the lumber was tied securely behind Cole's saddle, the rope fastened tight enough to face the wind ahead. The night outside had deepened into a quiet silver blue, and the moon hung low, cold and watchful above the prairie. Cole swung into the saddle. Dutch adjusted one final knot, slapped the horse's flank once, and stepped back. No blessing, no farewell. Just a nod that said, "Do what you know is right." Cole clicked his tongue softly, urging his horse forward. The boards knocked gently against each other with every stride, creating a slow, hollow rhythm that followed him onto the open land. Moonlight trailed along the edges of the pine, turning the lumber pale and ghost-like, almost as if Emma herself walked beside him, steadying his hand. The cold air bit his cheeks, but something warm flickered under his ribs. He wasn't just riding toward the creek. He was riding toward a decision he'd already made long before the wind toppled that wall. Toward a woman who needed help. Toward a purpose he thought he'd buried with Emma. And as the night stretched before him, silent and silvered, Cole Brennan felt, for the first time in a long time, like a man moving toward the right thing. Nita woke to the low, steady thud of hoofbeats rolling across the frozen ground. For a moment, she thought it was part of a dream, those drifting fragments of sound that visit a weary mind before sunrise. But then another soft clop echoed toward her, unmistakable and real, stirring her awake. She pushed herself upright, rubbing grit from her eyes. The world around her was washed in the pale silver of early dawn. the kind of light that made the land look both lonely and sacred. Frost clung to every blade of grass near the creek bend, and a thin mist hovered just above the ground, as if trying to hide what lay beneath. Then she saw it, a shadow rising against the dawn, tall, solid, shaped by the first gold edges of sunlight. Cole Brennan, the man and his horse, stood at the edge of her camp, the lumber tied behind the saddle casting long, angular shadows beside him. For a heartbeat, his silhouette looked larger than life, outlined by a halo of morning light that gave him the stillness of a stone monument. Nita's breath caught, not in fear, but in instinct. She rose to her full height, shoulders squared, chin lifted. Her eyes met his, calm, unreadable, steady. She'd learned long ago that flinching made a person look weak, and weakness was a language the land knew how to punish. Cole tilted his hat in a quiet greeting. She didn't return it, but she didn't step back either. For a long moment, it was just the two of them, standing in the cold morning air. No wind, no judgment, no movement, but the faint puff of breath leaving their lips. Then Cole spoke. His voice carried the grit of someone who'd spent his whole life out here, shaped by weather, loss, and responsibility. It wasn't harsh, it wasn't soft, just real, like the land itself. You can't outlast a storm with that pile of broken wood. He nodded toward the collapsed remains of her shelter. I brought lumber, good lumber, if you'll let me help. Nita blinked once, slow and measured, as if weighing every word. She studied him. Not the boards, not the horse, not the tools, but the man. His posture wasn't the posture of someone offering charity. His gaze wasn't expectant nor pitying. No handouts, no demands, just a simple offer, given plain and honest, exactly how people survived out here. She exhaled softly, a faint plume of steam drifting from her lips. Help, she repeated, not as a question, not as surrender, but as quiet acknowledgement. Cole dismounted without another word. He untied the lumber, the boards knocking gently together in a rhythm that seemed to warm the cold air. He carried them to the cleared patch of ground where her shelter had once dared to stand. Nita joined him, kneeling to hold the first plank steady as he positioned it. They worked without conversation at first, and strangely, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt useful, like each was listening to the other through movement more than sound. Cole measured angles with the natural precision of a man who'd spent half his life raising barns and mending fences. Nita followed his directions with sharp attention, quick, capable, unafraid of hard work. When he held a board, she hammered. When she lifted a beam, he steadied it. When the wind pushed against them, they leaned into it together. Once, the hammer slipped from her grip and clattered onto the frosty dirt. She muttered a short breath of frustration, but Cole simply picked it up and placed it back in her palm. Try again, he said, not unkindly. And she did. If someone had ridden past at that moment, they would have thought the two had been building structures side by side for years. Their rhythms synced naturally. Two lives used to struggle, now temporarily aligned in a shared purpose. As the sun climbed higher, the shape of a new shelter began to emerge. Taller, straighter, stronger. Made not from scraps, but from lumber chosen with care. Near midday, Nita stepped back, wiping sweat and frost from her brow. She looked at the walls rising solidly around her, disbelief flickering behind her steady eyes. Cole watched her take it in. He sensed her gratitude, though she spoke none. He felt her trust beginning to uncoil from whatever corner she'd buried it in. But he didn't press it, didn't claim it. He just nodded once, the gesture small but sincere. Two people, both cracked in different places, had managed to build something that might actually stand. And in the quiet between them, the air felt just a little warmer. By late afternoon, the new shelter stood firm against the rising wind, its walls straight and true beneath the thin winter sun. Cole stepped back, rolling his shoulders to ease the ache that had settled there after hours of lifting beams and driving nails. He wasn't complaining. The work had steadied him, as work often did. Nita stood a few feet away, tying her bedroll with careful, practiced movements. Her hands were still raw beneath the cloth wraps, trembling faintly each time she tightened a knot. The cold didn't help. Breath hung in the air between them like pale smoke, and frost nibbled at the edges of her shawl. Cole watched her for a long, quiet stretch. The shelter was sturdy. Good lumber made it so. But as he looked at her hunched shoulders, the worn blanket, the thin layer of snow already dusting the ground around her boots, He felt something stir in him, a thought that had been sitting in the back of his mind since last night but had finally taken shape. A roof could keep the wind away, but it wouldn't keep her alive through a winter this brutal. She tucked the last corner of her blanket under the bedroll and straightened. Her breath shivered out again. She wasn't fragile, not by any measure he knew, but there was toughness, and then there was facing winter alone. Even a strong woman could freeze before sunrise if luck turned wrong. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how heavy silence had become. "Nita." She turned, eyes steady and unreadable in the dimming light. She always met his gaze straight on. There was something he respected in that, an honesty that didn't need words. He stepped closer, letting his voice fall into that low, gravelly tone men used when they meant every word they spoke. "I'm not sure that shelter's enough for what's coming." She didn't flinch, only drew the shawl tighter around herself, as if bracing for another problem she'd have to solve alone. Cole rubbed his thumb along the edge of his glove, searching for the right way to say what needed saying. He wasn't good with speeches, never had been. Emma used to joke that he communicated better with fence posts than with people. But this wasn't a moment to hide behind silence. He tried again, clearer this time. "I have a place," he said. "Plenty of room, work too, real work, steady and fair." Her brows lifted slightly, but she didn't interrupt. He took a breath. "There's a warm fire in the house, and a bunk that'll keep the cold off. If you want..." His voice trailed off a moment, then settled. "You can stay on the Brennan Ranch for the winter. Help out. Earn your keep. No conditions. No expectations." There it was, simple, plain, offered without any rope attached. Nita stared at him quietly. Not suspicious, not offended, just thinking. The wind brushed strands of dark hair across her cheek. She didn't push them away. Her gaze drifted toward the new shelter, then toward the distant ridge where the sky was turning the color of bruised plum. Slowly, she exhaled, and in that breath he heard a lifetime of walking alone. When she finally spoke, it wasn't more than a whisper. "Why help me?" Cole shrugged lightly, though the answer weighed heavy on him. Because winter doesn't care how strong a person is, and because nobody should face it alone if they don't have to. No heroics, no hidden agenda, just truth. Another long silence fell between them, one that didn't feel empty, only careful. Nita's fingers flexed around the strap of her bedroll. Her shoulders eased. Something unspoken passed across her face, a soft shift of expression he couldn't fully read. But he could feel it. She stepped toward him. "All right," she said quietly, "I'll go." Not because she had no other choice. He could tell by the set of her jaw she'd survived far worse than a cold night. But because, for the first time in a long while, she felt the edge of safety brushing near her, like the warmth of a fire seen from far off. Cole nodded once, a small gesture that held more weight than either of them acknowledged out loud. They walked toward his horse together. It was a small thing, barely a change in the wide sweep of the prairie. But Cole felt the shift like a new nail driven into solid wood. Sometimes life broke a person down. Sometimes good lumber was given a second purpose. And sometimes, on a quiet winter afternoon, a man rode home with a stranger who wasn't quite a stranger anymore. The Brennan Ranch had always carried its own kind of quiet, wide, echoing, and edged with loneliness. After Emma died, that quiet had deepened into something heavier, a hush that settled into every beam of the house and every stall in the barn. Cole had grown used to it. He moved through the rooms like a man passing through old memories, careful not to stir anything awake. But Nita's arrival shifted the air in ways neither of them spoke about. The changes were small at first, subtle, almost shy. On the second morning at the ranch, Cole walked into the kitchen expecting the same clutter he'd left behind. Pots scattered, flour sacks slumped open, a stove that needed a good scrubbing. Instead, he found order. Not perfection, just calm, deliberate organization. Sacks stacked neatly, jars wiped clean, the stove blackened but functional, glowing with low coals she'd tended before sunrise. By noon, she'd made her way through the storage room beside the barn, pulling old tools off shelves, sorting what could be mended and what needed tossing. Within days, the tack room looked the way Emma had once imagined it. Bridles hung straight, cinches coiled tightly, space enough to breathe. Then came the corrals. Cole watched from the porch as Nita moved among the horses, not rushed, not fearful. She carried herself with a quiet certainty that eased even the spookier mares. She cleared hay that had molded in the corners, and swept out dry dust that had gathered like forgotten years. She fixed a loose hinge on the stall door with nothing more than patience and a steady hand. Emma would have liked that, he thought. The way Nita saw what needed doing and simply did it. It wasn't long before the ranch hands noticed. Dutch was the first to speak up. Though true to his nature, he didn't make a speech about it. One morning as Nita tightened the girth on a saddle, the old cowboy ambled over, chewing a piece of straw. "You've got a way around animals," he remarked, nodding toward the mare standing calmly beneath her hands. It was a simple statement, but coming from Dutch, it was a stamp of respect. Nita dipped her chin in acknowledgement, and that was enough for both of them. Garcia warmed to her next. He'd spent 30 years reading cattle-like scripture, and he noticed her watching from the fence line one afternoon. Instead of shooing her off, he waved her closer. "This here," he tapped a steer's flank, "is how you tell when one's been chewing too long without swallowing. Watch the rhythm, the way the ribs move." Nita listened as if each word were a rare coin. By the end of the week, she could spot a bloated calf or limping heifer long before Garcia did. He bragged about her quietly, but bragged nonetheless. Billy, the youngest hand, came last. Barely 15 and painfully earnest, he approached her one evening, holding a tattered book as though it might bite him. "Could you, maybe, help me read this?" He asked it so quietly, Cole almost missed it from the doorway. Nita didn't laugh, didn't brush him off. She sat beside him on the porch steps and read each sentence slowly, her voice steady and patient. Billy beamed like someone had handed him a key he'd been trying to carve himself for years. Cole saw this from a distance. Every shift, every small kindness, every way the ranch seemed to breathe easier with Nita in the mix. He didn't speak on it. Men like him rarely did, but he noticed. He noticed how the house no longer sounded hollow in the evenings, how the clatter of pots in the kitchen felt less like noise and more like life, how the wind passing through the open windows carried warm scents, stew simmering on the stove, fresh earth from the barn, saddle leather drying by the fire. One night as he walked across the yard, he heard laughter, quiet, restrained, but unmistakably real. Billy again, trying to pronounce a difficult word while Nita corrected him with patient firmness. Cole paused in the dark. For years he'd thought the ranch would never know warmth again, that some things died with Emma, and the land would simply have to accept it. But now, watching the faint yellow glow spill from the windows, hearing voices ripple gently against the night air, he felt something shift inside him. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a soft lifting, like frost melting from a fence rail in the first hint of spring. The Brennan Ranch wasn't loud, not yet, but it was no longer silent. And Cole Brennan, standing between the barn and the house, felt for the first time in a long while that he was no longer walking through the world alone. The trip into town began like any other routine supply run, quiet, necessary, unremarkable. Cole hitched the wagon by mid-morning, and Nita joined him without a word, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. The prairie stretched wide and pale on either side of the road, but the sky above was bright, almost too bright, as if trying to offer comfort neither of them yet felt. Dry Creek looked small as they approached, a scatter of wooden storefronts leaning into the wind like stubborn old men refusing to fall. Smoke curled from chimneys, horses clopped along hitch rails. A few townsfolk swept dust from their thresholds or hauled crates off wagons. It all seemed normal enough until eyes began to follow them. Nita stepped down first, her boots crunching over grit and frost. She moved with her usual quiet purpose, helping Cole unload sacks of flour and salt without drawing attention. But attention found her anyway. A pair of women paused at the mercantile door, whispering behind gloved hands. A store clerk nudged his brother with an elbow and tipped his chin toward Cole's wagon. Two ranchers leaning against a railing let their conversation trail off as Nita passed. None of them said a word out loud. Not a slur, not a comment about her being Apache. That wasn't the shape of this trouble. What stirred the air was something subtler, smaller, and edged with suspicion. Why is she living out there? Cole Brennan, taking in a young woman. What kind of arrangement is that? It was the kind of talk that didn't need to be spoken clearly for its meaning to land. Cole heard pieces of it as he walked inside the general store. He didn't react, didn't bristle, didn't even look their way. But his jaw tightened once. Just once. Nita caught it, and that was enough. By the time they reached the post office to fetch the mail, the whispers had grown heavier, still restrained, still muted, but unmistakably aimed at the two of them. Nita felt them like cold fingers brushing the back of her neck. She wasn't unfamiliar with being talked about. Life on the frontier carved rumors the way wind carves stone. But what she couldn't bear was the weight falling on Cole. She could leave. She had left places before. Cole, though. Cole had a ranch, a reputation, a business to maintain. Whispers like these stuck to a man in a small town. They grew roots. On the ride home, Cole spoke little. Nita spoke even less. The wagon wheels creaked over frozen ruts, carrying them through the long stretch of open land where the wind swallowed anything left unsaid. That night, long after supper dishes were washed and the lamps had dimmed, Nita packed quietly in the room Cole had given her. She didn't have much, just a blanket, a few tools, and the clothes folded neatly in a small stack. Her movements were calm, deliberate, but her chest felt tight with something she didn't dare name. She didn't want to leave. But wanting wasn't the point. She wouldn't drag trouble into a place that had finally begun to heal. She was tying her bedroll when the floorboard creaked behind her. Dutch stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his weathered face half shadowed by lantern light. He leaned one shoulder against the frame, watching her with the quiet patience of a man who'd seen more years than he cared to count. "You're fixing to run," he said softly. Nita didn't deny it. She kept working the knot at the edge of the blanket. "I won't bring trouble here," she murmured. Dutch let out a slow breath through his nose, almost a sigh, almost a chuckle. "Trouble," he repeated. "Folks in town been stirring up dust since the day I grew my first whisker. They'll talk themselves hoarse before sunrise." Nita didn't answer. Dutch stepped farther into the room, boots thudding softly on the boards. His voice dropped lower, rough but steady. "If you leave, Kao I se fai chien jau mot min." He paused, his gaze steady on her. "Vatoi Joan, ko kong fai kio ngoi bo mak ngoi kach." Her hands froze. Dutch wasn't a man given to speeches. He wasn't one to meddle either. For him to say this to her in this moment meant he saw something she was trying hard not to admit. She swallowed, the knot in her throat tightening more than the one under her fingers. "Kao I biet ko hong mon rakaroi," Dutch added. "Nhung kao I kung biet mot ranch, va monangoi, kong nen trong trai mai." Silence drifted between them, warm despite the chill. Slowly, very slowly, Nita loosened the rope she'd been pulling tight. The blanket sagged open in her lap. Dutch gave a single satisfied nod, turned, and left the doorway as quietly as he'd come. Nita sat there a moment longer, the half-packed bedroll beside her, the house settling gently around her like a hand resting on her shoulder. For the first time since arriving, she wondered if staying wasn't a burden, but a choice she finally wanted to make. Morning in Dry Creek came with a thin veil of dust drifting across the main street, stirred up by the first wagon wheels of the day. Storefront windows glinted with weak sunlight, and church bells chimed once, soft, hollow, barely carrying across the prairie. It should have been an ordinary Tuesday. But Cole Brennan tied his horse outside the bank with a purpose that caught the attention of the two ranchers, leaning near the hitching post. He stepped inside without hesitation. The bank lobby smelled of ink, paper, and cold metal, a place where decisions were made by men who rarely touched dirt with their bare hands. Mr. Thompson, the bank manager, looked up from behind his polished counter. His expression flickered with surprise, then something else. Caution, maybe. "Morning, Cole," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "What brings you in?" Cole rested both gloved hands on the counter. His voice came low, steady as the base of a fence post hammered deep into the ground. "I heard talk," he said. "Talk about how I run my ranch. Talk about who I hire." Thompson cleared his throat. "Folks are just curious. A young woman is an extra set of good hands," Cole cut in. "That's all anyone needs to know." The firmness in his tone made two clerks in the corner straighten. Cole wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. He had the kind of presence that carried its own volume. He continued slower now, as if choosing every word with care. "I hire workers based on character and ability, not on gossip, not on speculation." His jaw tightened. "And certainly not on what someone thinks they see from a store window." Mr. Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "Well now, Cole, people worry is all. A woman alone on your ranch?" Cole's eyes hardened, but his voice stayed level. "Work is work. Dignity is dignity. and a person trying to survive deserves a fair chance. I don't need the town's approval to offer that." Silence rippled through the room. The clerks exchanged looks. Thompson looked down at his ledger, but didn't turn a single page. Cole tipped his hat once, a gesture that ended the conversation as cleanly as a slammed door, and walked out. Outside, the wind kicked dust across his boots as he headed toward the church. A few townsfolk were sweeping the steps, pausing when they noticed him approaching. Reverend Hayes, a kind but timid man, stood beside the doorway, polishing the brass lantern. "Cole," he greeted with a nervous smile. "We don't see you here often." Cole nodded. "Reverend, I'm not here to cause trouble." The Reverend's shoulders eased slightly, but just slightly. "I'm here," Cole said, "because I heard talk outside your Sunday service." A woman near the steps flinched. Cole continued, voice even. "Someone said charity and compassion belong inside these walls but don't apply to a working ranch." He let the words land. "I figure that's backwards." The Reverend swallowed. "Well, people forget," Cole said, "that this land was built by folks helping each other when it wasn't easy. When a man or woman was alone out here, neighbors didn't whisper about it. They stepped up. A few heads lowered, not in shame, but in thought. Old memories resurfacing maybe. Tough winters, shared meals, barn raisings where everyone showed up. No questions asked." Cole didn't linger. He walked on. His next stop was the general store. Wooden crates lined the porch, and the front windows were crowded with curious faces as he stepped inside. The bell over the door chimed. "Morning, Cole," Milt, the shopkeeper, said cautiously. Cole didn't bother with small talk. "If anyone here has a question about the woman working on my ranch," he said, "ask me. Don't ask the sidewalk. Don't ask the saloon. And sure as hell don't ask each other behind shut doors." A hush fell over the aisles. He softened his tone, not in weakness but in clarity. "She's honest. She works hard. That's all that matters. That should be enough." For the first time that day, someone nodded. A ranch wife near the flour sacks murmured, "Hard work's hard work." Another man tapped his hat in agreement. Small shifts, but real ones. Cole gave them a single nod in return. Then he stepped outside. The street stretched quiet before him. Dust drifted. Horses stamped their feet. The world waited. Cole walked to the center of the road. Boots planted wide, shoulders squared, chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't hiding. He simply stood there, still and unshaken, letting the whole town see. For the first time in years, Dry Creek saw Cole Brennan not as a grieving widower, but as the man he used to be, a rancher with a spine of iron, a heart that made its own choices, and a will strong enough to turn a tide. That day became a turning point, because he stood tall when it mattered, and people remembered that kind of courage. The sun was lowering behind the cottonwoods when Cole rode back into the yard, the sky painted in long brush strokes of burnt orange and fading gold. Evening had settled over the Brennan Ranch with a soft stillness, broken only by the shuffle of horses in their stalls and the distant clatter of a loose gate tapping against a post. Nita stood near the porch, her hands wrapped around the edge of her shawl, fingers curled with a tension she'd been holding since he left that morning. She hadn't meant to wait outside, but her feet had drawn her here hours ago, long before she heard the first echo of hooves on the ridge. She didn't move as he rode closer, didn't call out, didn't ask what happened, but her eyes searched his face with a quiet, fragile hope she couldn't hide. Cole swung down from the saddle. For a moment, neither spoke. Dust swirled between them in the cold dusk, rising and falling like the breath of the land itself. He took off his hat, held it loosely at his side. "It's done," he said simply. She nodded once, though her throat tightened. She knew what done meant. Cole Brennan had fought for her, stood in the center of town and made it clear she belonged here as much as any man working the range. He'd put his reputation, his pride, and his silence on the line. Not for show, not out of obligation, but because he believed it was right. And because, whether he spoke it or not, she mattered to him. A cold breeze brushed past, tugging a few strands of hair across her cheek. She pulled them back slowly, steadying herself. She had been preparing to leave. She'd folded her blanket, rolled her tools, and told herself it was for the best. But the truth had been sitting heavy in her chest all day. She didn't want to walk away from this place, not since he'd shown her kindness without a single string attached. Cole's gaze softened as he looked at her, reading more in her expression than she intended to reveal. He stepped closer, slow enough for her to decide whether to step back. She didn't. His voice came low, warm, carrying that rough honesty she'd grown to trust. "Don't go anywhere," he said. He paused, searching her eyes. "This ranch needs you." Her breath hitched, just enough for him to notice. Then quieter, so quiet she almost didn't hear it, except the words fell straight into the hollow in her chest that had been empty for far too long. "I need you too." Nita blinked hard. The world around them seemed to pause. The fading sun, the restless horses, even the breeze slipping through the barn rafters. Not because his words were romantic or dramatic. They weren't. They were plain, steady, grounded in truth. And that made them hit deeper than any tender phrase could have. She nodded, the gesture small but certain. "All right," she whispered, "I'll stay." From that night forward, something shifted on the Brennan Ranch. Subtle things at first, shared tasks that became routine. A rhythm formed between them, the kind that didn't need planning or explanation. They fed the horses together at sunrise, working side by side in easy silence, broken only by the sound of oats hitting wooden troughs. Cole repaired a fence line while Nita checked the cattle, her sharp eye catching a limping steer before it became a problem. They cooked supper together, sometimes stew, sometimes beans and cornbread, always eaten at the small table beneath the worn oil lamp Emma once polished every Sunday. And in the evenings, when the day's work was finally done, they sat near the fire. Not close enough to touch, not far enough to feel apart, just close enough that the warmth between them grew without announcing itself. They talked sometimes about the land, about the storms rolling in, about the odd behavior of a mule with too much personality. Other nights they said nothing at all, letting the soft crackle of the fire fill the space. Piece by piece, brick by brick. Though neither used words like love or home, the foundation of something new took shape, something steady, something honest. And Cole found himself listening for her footsteps in the hallway without realizing he was doing it. And Nita found the knot in her stomach easing each time she walked into a room where he already was. The ranch was no longer just a place she worked. It was becoming something else. A place where two lives, scarred, stubborn, quietly hopeful, had started to fit side by side. A place that was beginning, unmistakably, to feel like a home. Spring didn't arrive on the Brennan Ranch all at once. It seeped in slowly, the way warmth does after a hard winter, softening edges, loosening the earth, inviting life to move again. The mornings grew gentler. The horses, stronger now from Nita's careful tending, grazed with easy confidence across the pasture. Smoke curled from the chimney each dawn, steady and bright, a signal that the kitchen never sat cold anymore. And people laughed, not loudly, not constantly, but in that quiet, unguarded way that slips out when a house finally remembers how to breathe. Cole noticed it first in the bunkhouse. Dutch humming while he shaved, Garcia telling a joke that actually landed, Billy reading out loud from a book Nita had given him, slow, halting, but proud. The ranch hadn't been this alive since before the grief that nearly consumed it. One afternoon, when the sunlight was soft and slanting across the yard, Nita walked toward the far edge of the property, toward the place where she had once built a crooked shelter out of rotting wood and hope that was barely hanging on. The old lean-to was still there, stubborn as a mule, the planks warped and weathered but holding together. She stood in front of it with her arms folded lightly, not out of cold, but out of memory. It wasn't shelter, it wasn't safety. It was where she had thought her life might end. Cole's footsteps approached over the grass, slow and respectful, as if he knew she needed a moment before he entered it. He stopped beside her, hands in his pockets, eyes on the lopsided boards. "Hard to believe that thing made it through the winter," he said softly. Nita let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. He nudged a boot against one of the planks. It wobbled but held. After a long pause, he spoke again. His voice low, warm, full of an honesty that came easier around her than anyone else. "One day," he said, "if you want, we could rebuild it." She turned her head slightly, studying him. "Rebuild it," she repeated. "Not to hide in," he added quickly. "Not like before." His thumb brushed the edge of one of the boards almost fondly. "But to remind us where we started, what we came through." The words sat between them like a marker in the dirt. Simple but carved with meaning. Nita didn't answer right away. She looked at the shelter again, at the stubbornness it took for something so fragile to survive storms it was never built to handle. She understood that feeling more than she wanted to admit. Cole drew a breath, steadier than she expected. And then, without ceremony or hesitation, he said the thing that shifted the wind inside her chest. "If you stay longer." He paused, searching the horizon as though the right words were waiting out there. "This ranch is big enough for the two of us to decide everything together. Not a confession, not a proposal, just a door, left open wide enough for her to step through whenever she was ready." A gentle breeze moved across the field, carrying the deep, resonant sound of distant cattle. Grass whispered in long waves. The sky glowed with the warm gold of late afternoon, coating the ranch in a soft, forgiving light. Nita let her fingers drift across a board of good lumber stacked nearby. Smooth, sturdy, clean. Nothing like the brittle pieces that had once held up the fragile edge of her life. Good lumber, good land, and standing beside her, a good man. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the wind settle her thoughts, letting the moment speak in ways neither of them needed to. When she opened them, she smiled, quiet, sure, almost new. Cole didn't touch her. He didn't move closer. He just met her smile with one of his own, the kind that came from deep inside a man who had finally stopped living like a ghost. Around them, the ranch breathed with the promise of spring, a future not guaranteed, but possible, solid, like the wood beneath her fingertips. Two lives once splintered by loss, now standing on ground they had rebuilt together. Not with haste, not with grand gestures, but with good lumber and good hearts. And that was enough.